Okay, the second group of Western settlers were the cowboys. Cowboys actually originated in South America. A lot of the words that we associate with cowboys, like lasso, are Spanish in origin. After the Civil War, the job of a cowboy was pretty simple. In Texas, what we have is the gradual development of a cow, the Texas Longhorn, that's hardy enough to live and survive on the Great Plains, just left to its own devices. And farmers there would have huge herds of these Texas Longhorn, and it was the cowboy's job to round them up. The farmer would mark the cattle. The cowboy would round up the cattle and follow one of these 4 trails north to a railroad, a cow town. The first one was in Abilene, Kansas, and the cows would then be taken by a company on trains. They would be taken east, and they would be killed, slaughtered, and processed. Cowboys, the cowboy era lasted 20 years. 1867 was the first long drive north of the cowboy. They ended in 1887 after a very harsh winter that killed off a lot of the Texas Longhorn, and farmers decided to build ranches, and they built ranches that didn't allow, basically, the cowboys to use these trails. And the ranches were able to be built because of a new invention, barbed wire, which made it really easy to fence off huge ranches in this area. And the last group would be farmers, and we go back to the Homestead Act. Remember, the federal government passed the Homestead Act, which provided very cheap land, 160 acres of land out west. So farmers headed to the Great Plains thanks to the Homestead Act. Railroads were also hugely important in encouraging farmers to go west. And we're talking about these states, the Great Plains states, heavily populated by farmers thanks to the Homestead Act. Also, it's the timing of when farmers go. It's not only the Homestead Act, it's also technology. After the Civil War, we're going to see several inventions that make it easier to farm on the Great Plains. For example, the mechanical reaper, the steel plow, seed drills, things like that. Pros and cons of farmers settling west. The pros are going to be that we settle the Great Plains states. Another pro would be that we have a new breadbasket. This is our third. Remember, we've talked about different breadbaskets. In the colonial time period, it was the middle colonies. During the market revolution, we talked about the old Northwest being the breadbasket, places like Ohio and Illinois. And the breadbasket shifts further west to the Great Plains. States like Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, North Dakota, all you can see in those states are wheat fields. The biggest con is going to be the fact that Native American life is going to be disrupted. Acts like the Kansas-Nebraska Act are going to open up areas for white settlement at the expense of Native Americans. And the illustrations at the bottom are examples of some of the technology. That's the mechanical reaper that chopped down crops. And this is a threshing machine from 1881. Crops that had been chopped down would be fed through this machine and kind of tied up so they could be ready to ship east. Obviously, the big victims in all of this were Native Americans, so we want to look at the effect that all of this Western settlement had on Native Americans. And there are different stages of Native American relationships with white settlers. The first stage, stage one, is I've labeled it assimilation, although how much assimilation really went on is arguable. But from the founding of the nation to about the 1820s, Native Americans were encouraged to become white, quote unquote. And of course, the best example of that was in the Southwest, the old Southeast, states like Georgia, and Florida, where tribes like the Cherokee had adopted white ways. Of course, the reward for doing that is to be removed under Andrew Jackson. So in the 1830s and the 1840s, the policy of the government was to remove all of the eastern tribes east of the Mississippi, remove them west to the Great Plains, where they were promised that they would be left alone. Obviously, things changed almost as soon as those Native American tribes were moved. And in the 1850s, we get the passage of different acts where it's becoming clear that white settlers want to move to the Great Plains. And we get the Fort Laramie Treaty, where the government basically tries to sign agreements and with Native American tribes where they get Native American tribes to kind of specify where they will be hunting. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the gold strikes of the 1850s are going to disrupt the Fort Laramie Treaty. What that leads to is in the 1860s a war with the Sioux, and pretty much from the Civil War to about 1890, pretty much constant warfare in the Great Plains. And it leads to stage 4. Because of the war with the Sioux and other conflicts, the government is going to try to move Native Americans to reservations. And what we're trying to do is to get Native Americans here to abandon their old habits and to become white. And that is going to cause further conflict. You can see in the after the Civil War the number of forts that are built out west to protect Western settlers. You can also see the conflicts that happened out west. In the 1880s, a couple of things happened. We have the publishing of a book called A Century of Dishonor by a woman called Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson basically described a situation where the federal government had basically mistreated Native Americans and made false promises and reneged on those promises. At the same time, this is written right at the time when the federal government is trying to herd Native Americans onto reservations. So the reservation policy becomes kind of married to the philosophy in Helen Hunt Jackson's book. And so what the government and what the majority of American whites are going to want to happen is reservations plus the two policies that you see up here. So we are going to found Indian schools for the children of Native Americans. The most famous one was at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And we're also going to pass a law called the Dawes Severalty Act, which basically is going to treat Native American land on reservations like white land. And they're going to treat it kind of like the Homestead Act, where each Indian family on a reservation would get 160 acres of land. And the Native Americans will be encouraged to farm that land. And you can see what happens to Native American lands under this policy. They basically shrink, shrink, shrink until you get to the situation we have in 1890, and pretty much the situation we have in the present day, and that is that we have very little land left that Native Americans are on. The problem is these reservations just make Native Americans more vulnerable. So here's the Great Sioux Reservation in 1868. By 1877, the Sioux had lost land because gold had been found on part of their land. By 1889, 2 years after the Dawes Act had been passed, the Sioux lost more land, because basically what we said to Native Americans after the Dawes Act, after we said that families had to have 160 acres of land, any land that wasn't being used could be opened up for white settlement. You can see the effect of these policies. Now, on one hand, these policies are trying to, in a kind of strange way, they're trying to get Native Americans integrated into the United States. But the cost of it was a huge loss of land to Native Americans and a disruption of their heritage and their tribal customs and that kind of thing. Sioux are the biggest victims, are the first victims and the biggest victims. By the 1890s, Great Plains Indians, led by the Sioux, are angry, and they are almost messianic in their outlook on life. By the early 1890s, they're listening to a Native American who is preaching the end of the world, and he is preaching a certain kind of religious ritual called the ghost dance. And people who followed this believed that the world was ending, and people who participated in this ritual would not be able to be harmed by white American weapons, and people believed the world was ending, and Native Americans who died would be resurrected. What the ghost dance did in places like Oklahoma was scare the pants off white settlers. As a result, the government moved in, and tragically in 1890 attacked Sioux Indians and killed 146 of them, many of whom were women and children. And that is called Wounded Knee, and it kind of marks the end of conflict on the Great Plains. At this point, Native American tribes have been completely subdued. The events of that day were pretty shocking. Congressional testimony captures the horror of the army attacking Sioux men, women, and children. And there was a snowstorm at that point, and the Native Americans were basically frozen there for a short while, and frozen in their kind of death throes, if you like, and this is one example of a rather grisly picture from the Battle of Wounded Knee. Of course, one of the things that I want you to think about is the image of the Wild West, because we have this image of the Wild West. Certainly, I had it when I was a kid, of cowboys and Indians, and out of our image of the Wild West comes from kind of the Eastern perception of the West. And one of the ways that there were a couple of ways that East kind of found out about the West. One way was dime novels, pulp fiction, these cheap, trashy books that were sold for literally a dime in the East, that had all kinds of outlandish stories about what went on in the West. and they made people famous like Billy the Kid and that kind of thing. And the other great way that people found out about the West, not very truthfully, however, would be poor Bill Cody's Wild West show, which reenacted the exploits of what he did and kind of, in a strange way, educated people on, or informed people, not always correctly, about what the West was like. Another thing that I want you to think about would be the ending of the frontier. In 1890, the federal government announced that the frontier had closed, that there was no more frontier. This had a huge effect on the American mind, if you like. Americans had always been able to move west, and a historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner is going to deliver a pretty important address in 1893. And it's so significant that it's one of the few theories in history that has a name attached to it. It's called the Jackson thesis, and the thesis is basically that the frontier was crucial in forming American character. A lot of Western historians today kind of question the black and white way that Jackson presented the frontier. To Jackson, the frontier was the line between civilization and barbarity, and as our frontier pushed west, white Americans brought civilization west, and it's a really interesting theory, and there's definitely something to it. The American West has been important, but a lot of historians don't accept the Jackson thesis at face value. They qualify it a little bit. But if you hear the term, the Jackson thesis, it's talking about how significant the frontier was, and also how significant it was when the government announced that there was no more frontier. Because when they announced that in the 1890s, people are going to be very scared. People are going to start saying, well, if there's no frontier, how are we going to prevent large-scale social revolution in the United States? And it's no coincidence that right when the frontier is declared to be closed in the United States, that's the 1890s, right when the United States becomes very interested in taking over foreign countries.